Thank you so much for coming here tonight. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Ann Waltner for tonight's presentation. Dr. Waltner is a professor of Chinese history at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Her teaching and research interest lies in the cultural, religious, and social history of China. Dr. Waltner is the co-author of a recent book, Family, A World History by Oxford University. Ann Waltner is currently working on a collaborative research project which focuses on the transition from girlhood to adulthood in China and Europe. Dr. Waltner has extensive service and professional experience, including service as a board member of the Association for Asian Studies, Associate Dean for Academic Programs at the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts, editor of the Journal of Asian Studies, and founding director of the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Minnesota. So beyond all these great achievements, Dr. Waltner is a great educator and dearest, most warm-hearted mentor for the students. For hundreds and hundreds of students over 2 decades, and gave the most generous support and help. So when Carol Brash, who is in the audience, Joe Rogers, who is in the audience tonight, and me, when we are doing a good job as teachers and advisors, thanks should really go to Ann. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Ann to our campus.
Thank you very much. I am very glad to be here, and it's actually kind of thrilling to be at a place where you have 3 former students who are teaching and running the place. I mean, I don't know actually if any of my colleagues have a place like that. So it's been very thrilling, very thrilling to be here. What I'm going to do today is tell you about work that's fairly brand new work. And there are advantages to talking about new work. You're still very excited about it. There are disadvantages because you probably haven't figured out everything. What I want to do today is kind of structure the talk as a detective story. Look at ways in which, after you found a document or a piece of evidence or a source, how do you go about asking questions that will enable you to come to conclusions? So what I'm going to do is I'll talk to you about a source and what I think it can tell us, and then I'll also talk about what the limitations are. So Sophia gave a very generous introduction. I'm a social historian of Ming and Qing China at the University of Minnesota. And as my work is on marriage and family in Ming and Qing Dynasty China. The story of today's paper actually begins with an earlier paper. This is something that I think happens to all of us. It really happens to historians. You always want to, things lead to another. So I just finished a paper Okay, I just finished a paper on this wedding procession. This wedding procession is also published in 1735. It occurs in a book edited by, or really compiled by, a Jesuit named Jean-Baptiste Duhalde, and it's called, in French, Description of China. What interested me in some ways about this, for the purposes of today's paper, is Duhalde says in the preface to the book that all of the pictures are drawn in the style of Chinese pictures. You don't have to know a lot about Chinese art to know this is not Chinese art. There are ways in which if you look at this wedding procession, you know that the man who did the engraving knew something about Chinese wedding impressions, but it's not Chinese art. In the preface, he gives the name of the person who sent pictures from Canton to Paris, and I was really interested in this whole question of the source pictures. So I Googled the man who allegedly sent the pictures, and I found out actually that it was his father. I originally thought it was him, but it was his father, married a Chinese woman. And I thought this was very, very interesting. And I found out that her picture was hanging in the family chateau in Paris. So I Googled the chateau. I sent an email, info at the name of the chateau, and mentioned that I had read this and just asking her, saying that I'd heard that the picture was hanging in the family chateau. Well, I will learn this, and here it is. This is still hanging in the family chateau, and when I got back and was telling people this story, people would say, but how do you know they were really married? And finally, I decided that the best answer to that is her picture is still hanging in the family chateau. So this is sort of the prequel to the paper that I'm going to give in terms of my looking for sources for the image. I looked at her husband's papers. There was nothing about her. I may try to do some work on this image, and it's painted on a mirror, and it's still hanging. So as I was finally finishing the paper, again, as a result of what I kind of now come to think of as wild Googling, I ran into an article that talked about another book published in France in 1735 that had a wedding procession in it. The book, and this is a reproduction of one of the versions of the book. It's called, in French, a book of Chinese designs. There are 13 copies of it extant. Well, this is a reproduction. There are 13 original copies extant. One of them has bound in it I really have no skills. No, I think I should do it. Yeah. Oh no. Okay, this is itty here. This is itty bitty. I'll show it to you bigger. Okay, this is the book it's bound in. This is from here to there is 10 feet long. From here to here is about it's about 2.5 feet. It is. You can see the folds here. It's folded up. It's printed. I mean, it's not printed. It was bound with the book when the book was originally published. So it is a wedding procession. The reason I'm showing you this now is I want to give you a kind of a sense of the flow of the images. This is the bride here in a red sedan chair. Here is a nice little circle of women who are they're talking to one another. We go through here. I'll talk a little bit about this mystery object. We have here a circle of musicians, and I kind of like the way in this image there are lines that are interrupted with nice circles of people talking. Again, up here we have another circle of musicians. So this is the image. This book designed to be useful in providing designs to ornament porcelain, lacquer, and textiles at a place called Chantilly in France. And 1735 is a time when Europeans are actually very interested in developing porcelain technology. European porcelain was first produced in a place called Meissen in the very early 18th century, and other sites are very anxious to develop the technology. An advertisement for the book appeared in an Amsterdam newspaper in 1735. And you could buy the book in 4 different ways. You could buy it in a calfskin binding on really high-class paper. You could buy it in a calfskin binding in lower-class paper. You could buy it on lower-class paper with no binding, or you could buy individual sheets. So this is a painting that's bound with the book. I think the advertisement makes it clear that the book had a commercial nature, that the publisher at least saw the commercial possibilities of the text. The book has virtually no words in it. There are two things in it that are words. One is a very effusive dedication to the Duke of Bourbon, who's actually the Duke who is at Chantilly. And there's a copy of the patent that's granted to the publisher to publish the work. The patent says anybody who counterfeits the work will be fined 10,000 livres. And according to Wikipedia, in 1726, 8 ounces of gold was worth 740 livres. I didn't actually do the math. The point is, it's a heap of money. So again, there's a bit of fear, I think, about pirating. We do not know anything about anything particular, specific about how this ended up in the hands of the man who made the book. And we don't know very much about the man who made the book. His surname is Fraisse, F-R-A-I-S-S-E. He's born in Grenoble in France around 1680. Until about 1718, he worked there. He's a master embroiderer, and I think it was a little bit unusual in early 18th century France for a man to be an embroiderer, but he was. And he worked at Chantilly beginning in about 1729. In 1735, he published the volume I'm talking about today. On the 14th of March in 1737, he was arrested for stealing a cane from a duke in a dining hall. He died in jail sometime before 1939. We know he died before 1939 because his wife died in 1939 and she is described as a widow. We know quite a bit more about the Duke of Bourbon. He is deeply involved in the East India Company. And so the question of how this painting came into the possession of at Chantilly is actually not so mysterious. When the Duke of Bourbon dies in 1740, there's an inventory taken of his holdings, and he had more than 2,000 objects that came from China, Japan, India, and Persia. So he's very, very interested in acquiring objects from the East, and he's particularly interested in acquiring objects from the East which will be useful in designs for textiles, porcelain, and lacquer manufacturer. There is a preface to the book where Fraisse says, "How surprised would be a Chinese to see in the middle of France a porcelain factory whose products equal the most splendid Chinese porcelains of the distant past and are far superior to anything produced today. And what would an Indian say after seeing the painted fabrics which so resemble those of India that he himself would be deceived. So there are 13 versions of this text. There are more copies of individual plates. No two versions of the text are identical. It contains a mixture of engraving and woodblock prints. Only 3 of the books are hand-colored. The one at the Bibliothèque Nationale is. And it's entirely possible that the version that has the painting in it was designed and presented to the Duke himself. The Bibliothèque Nationale, the French National Library, acquired the book after the French Revolution, when the Duke's possessions were confiscated in 1793. So the National Library has owned it since 1793. The painting is not printed. It is a hand painting, and it only exists in this one. The painting, and actually I think I'm going to move forward so you can actually see some detail. Well, okay, this is a little bit more detail, and I will eventually show you even more detail, but I think this, you can actually get a better sense of the painting from this half. The painting does not look like export painting that was made in the late 18th and 19th century. It is possible that the painting was made for export. It's possible that the painting was made as wallpaper. Chinese wallpaper had been known in China, in Europe since the late 17th century. In 1695, there's an auction of 66 lengths of what they called Japan paper at a place called the Marine Coffee House in London. It's clear that what they meant by Japan paper was paper from China and Japan. The painting is finished by another hand. If you look, you can see a line here. That is the top of the painting. When the painting was bonded to other paper, someone or other decided that that hill needed to be finished, that hill needed to be finished, that those trees needed to be finished. This finishing actually is not so obvious. This is really obvious. It wasn't unusual for people who had Chinese wallpaper to cut it, to make collages. So I think that whoever owned this, it felt appropriate to take it and finish it. I think it's really interesting, and I think you could probably make an argument that the Western artist who bound the painting perhaps had different ideas about the representation of space than the Chinese original artist did. One of the things that I think I'll do in the future is show a slide that has the painting without the additions, so people can get a clearer sense of the difference that space makes. It may be that the painting was trimmed prior to mounting and binding. There is a clear place where the painting is cut. I think right here you can see that's non-contiguous. And again, it was not so unusual for wallpaper to be cut, and so that looks like it was. I'm going to proceed to talking about the painting in some detail, but I want to talk a little bit about genres before I proceed to talking about this painting. I've actually never seen a painting quite like this one before. I mean, I kind of went bonkers when I saw it. Wedding processions are fairly rare as a subject in Chinese painting. There's a rich tradition of scrolls which are street scenes. This is sort of a street scene, but I think What is really of interest to this painter is the procession that is going on here. These buildings are not quite incidental, but it's very different than other genres of street scenes, which are mainly more urban. And there are other examples. There are woodblock prints, but I think that this is something that is really quite unusual. Wedding processions are, however, of ethnographic interest. And these are terrible prints, so I won't make you look at them too long. These are this comes from a Japanese work by a man named Aoki Masaru, who studied in Beijing in the 1920s, and he collected a lot of information on Chinese customs. And these are woodblock prints, and what I have here is a bad reproduction of a bad reproduction of a bad reproduction, so you can hardly see it. But you can see there are some of the similar kinds of things. You can see similar banners and things like that. So I just wanted to show you that there's a way in which the ethnography is of interest. So what I want to do now, if I can locate what I want, is walk you through the painting. And what I'd like to do now is just sort of talk about the painting. And what I would really like is as I am doing that, if you have questions or comments, if you interrupt me, if I'm looking, you can raise your hand if you would like. If I'm looking at the painting, I may not see a raised hand, so you might have to actually speak. So here is the bride is in the sedan chair. And I mentioned this earlier. What we have here is a group of women. There are 13 women in the painting. These are women who are beside the sedan chair, and I think I really like this little group of people. They're having a conversation with one another. I think I kind of get the sense of this that the wedding is an occasion for them to be out. The article that briefly mentioned this, that brought my attention to it, says that it's a wedding procession through a Manchu village. I don't know why the person says that. I think it's very interesting. You can see little feet. You can see feet under the women's dresses that may indicate that the women don't have bound feet. Manchu women did not bind their feet, but there's nothing in the picture that actually gives me clues about where the painting is, and I suspect since it ended up in Paris, it was probably produced in Canton in the south. You can see here there are women peering out of the window. This is a bookseller. This is a boot seller. There's food of some sort here. If you'll notice, most of the men are wearing hats that are more or less identical. And in a moment we'll come and we'll see a hat seller. Here is a little shop with jugs in it. And that might be a shop selling jugs, or it might be a shop selling vinegar or oil or soy sauce or something that is in a jug. Now, any luck, the next one will be the next one.
Excuse me? I have a question.
Yes.
So, were the two women on the side of the bride's cart, could they be her mother and sister?
Use it to scroll, don't push on it. I think the scroll ones you use scroll.
You know, I'm just going to do it the old-fashioned way. This is a disaster. They could be her mother and sister. I don't know. And I think in a more upper class family, there would be other sedan chairs that would bring the women up. But I think probably clearly, I would imagine that there are female relatives among this group. I couldn't tell by looking whether any of the people in the group were servants or not. I mean, it kind of looks to me like everybody is of the same social class. But I think the assumption that maybe it's mother and sister is a good assumption. There is this tradition of brides writing poetry that are kind of laments when they leave their parents' house. And they would sometimes write them with their sisters or other good friends. And it's a ritualized expression, but I think it's also real. I mean, you know, you're marrying a man you don't know, and you're probably going to live in another village, and it's going to be hard for you to see your mother and sisters and friends again. And so it is, I mean, it's exciting, but it's also really heartbreaking. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I'll get out of the way in a minute. So then what we have here is we have some mysteries that I can explain to some degree. These are fireworks. This is a kid about ready to set off a firework. These are geese or ducks. And geese are actually often a part of wedding processions. Geese are yang animals. Yang as in the yin-yang polarity, or not polarity, but, well, I guess you could say they're poles that are in motion with one another. Yang is the male principle, and I think that there was a feeling that a wedding procession is really kind of a yin thing, and so geese are ready. Geese are important for to counterbalance that. This is one of my favorite things in the painting. So this kid is going to set off a firecracker. This guy is looking at the geese as if he's kind of thinking, I don't know if it's really smart to set off a firecracker near geese. This, I still don't really know what it is. They are gourd-shaped. They might be real gourds. I doubt it. I don't think you could find that many gourds that are that symmetrical. Gourds symbolize fertility. And there is a passage, I think, on weddings from the Li Ji that talks about many, 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 many gourds, meaning much, 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 much fertility. So I think that's probably what they represent. If you look carefully at this, you can see it looks like there are somehow strings or wires or something that are holding them up. And these are ewers. There are pitchers that look very much like the pitchers that a young couple would use to drink, to offer toasts to one another. Because I'm interested in textile production, I am super interested in the clothing. We don't see any clothing stores in the scroll. The clothes that they are wearing, almost everyone in this picture is wearing patterned clothing. The patterns can be produced in two ways. They can be produced by weaving, brocade kind of weaving, or it could be produced by embroidery. And I suspect that the weaving is the least expensive way of doing it, but it's not inexpensive. And making brocaded fabric like this is not something that ordinary peasants could have done in their houses. So these probably were purchased somewhere else. When I say that, I am actually doing something that I often caution people against. I'm treating this as if it's a photograph, which is a transparent representation of reality, which of course it isn't. Nonetheless, I think it's extremely interesting that everybody is wearing patterned clothes. I mean, even these guys who are peddlers are wearing, even though they're wearing short jackets, they're wearing patterned clothing. Yeah, those jugs are look like the jugs in the painting. So here we have a group of musicians, and these are the musicians in the middle of the procession. And the musicians in the front of the procession, who I'll show you in a minute, they've got gongs and drums, and I think they're kind of to clear the way. So you've got here a variety of musicians with flutes and stringed instruments. And again, one of the things that I really like about the painting is I think if you kind of look at him, he really looks like he's listening to the rest of the music. Here you have what looks to me to be like wooden geese. Like I said, geese are common in wedding processions, and ritual experts debated whether you could substitute wooden geese for real geese. So I think in this wedding procession we have both wooden geese and real geese. This you can hardly see because it's at the fold of the book, but one of the men riding horses, there are two men riding horses, one of the men riding horses is riding side saddle. Here you have a fruit cellar, and actually you can't really see this in this version, but when you're looking at it, you really can see the knife that he's chopping with. I think those are bananas. So you've got here a fruit cellar, and here I think these are also food cellars.
Question.
Yes.
Why do the musicians all have like horns on their hats?
Well, there are two answers to that. The first is I don't know. The second is all musicians have it. The musicians in the next group do too, and they are the only people who have it. I think it's a kind of uniform. I mean, it shows that they are musicians. I've tried looking in other places for other examples, but I think in this particular painting, that's clear what it represents. And the hats are quite similar. But I mean, that's a great question. That's a very observant question. Yeah, you could do that. When. Okay, so here we have another sort of mysterious thing. These are candles here. This is a dragon. And I think the dragon, have you ever seen anything that looks like that? I think that the dragon symbolizes yang, the male force, and so the gourds are female fertility. So it's kind of to balance it out. But I think it's one of the strangest and most interesting things I've seen, and so it's clearly being taken with the bride as part of the marriage. What we have here is, I think, really, really cool. This is a gourd, and I think probably what is here would have had the name of the medicine shop. This is a this represents, I think, well, it could be one of several things, but it's not shocking to see it by a medicine shop. He's got a whisk there that sort of represents, suggests that he might be a Taoist. Here you have a little tiny figure of a human being with great, great, great big needles coming out of him that I suspect are acupuncture needles. And then here there are a couple of jugs, and I think that some of these might be talismans that would be sort of show, I mean, a talisman is something that what you might do is you might burn it and then mix it with water and drink it, and it would make you healthy. And I think these are maybe drug packets. These are people who are somehow asking this guy for help. One of the things that really interests me, and I don't know, maybe I'm over-interpreting, these three people have darker skin than, say, these three people. It's always possible that it's simply discoloration, but I kind of don't think so. So anyway, I'm interested in that. I don't know for sure who this guy is. He is the only one with a feather. I suspect, and I think I have some visual evidence that I may or may not get around to showing you from other paintings where there is a landlord or an official walking the fields who is wearing a hat with a feather and carrying an umbrella. I mean, a man carrying a big ceremonial umbrella is a little bit of a perplexity, because if he's really a big deal, why is he carrying his own umbrella? If he's not really a big deal, why does he have that? He's clearly an important person. I don't think he could be the bridegroom. He's too old. So, and then we have here, I think this is what I used on the poster. She's peering out. I like the image of women who are allegedly enclosed, peering out and seeing things. And then here you see this wonderful hat shop. You can see where all these guys get their red hats from, and I think you can see that red is maybe the only option. This is an example of finishing off the painting in ways that are a little odd. If you leave the top sort of to the imagination, you don't know what the top of the building looks like. They've kind of finished it off so that this looks like the hat shop is an open air hat shop, which is probably not the case. Next. Okay, so since this evidence is here, this is actually from a painting that was brought back in the late 18th century. And here we see a guy walking in the fields with a feather in his hat and with a big umbrella. Actually, this painting was brought back by the McCartney mission, which is a really famous mission that went to China in the late 18th century to try to establish relations with China. And it fell apart for several reasons. One of them being the Chinese wanted the British to kowtow, to bow to the ground, prostrate themselves on the ground. They said, we don't do that to the Queen of England, we're not doing it to the Emperor of China. There were other issues too. You want to do the next one? I think this is the context that the image comes from, and you can see that he's walking the fields. Next, and this is actually this is from a genre of painting called mapped pictures of tilling and weaving, which show actually the happy peasants at work doing agriculture and textile work. And you can see that here we have a guy, I guess he doesn't have a feather on his hat, but he's walking, he looks fairly much like the guy in the last image that had a feather in his hat. And so I then might come to the conclusion that my mystery guy is sort of a local landlord or local official. And that's sort of the kind of work that has to be done to figure out what's going on in these paintings. You want another one? Okay, so here we have, I guess I put this in so you could, again, kind of see the rhythm of the painting. Here's this strange dragon, the little medicine shop. And then here we have the musicians that are kind of clearing the way, making a lot of noise. I think maybe the next one should be a detail of the second half. Yes, it is. At first, when I saw a reproduction of this, I thought that what these were brooms, but they're not. They're two horns. Each of these guys has a pretty big horn and then a really big horn, and they're I guess more horns. And you can see they've got the musicians' horns on them. This person is the only person in the painting that is barefoot. But he's still wearing a patterned gown, and he's a flower, a plant peddler. He's kind of leaning on the plant carrier. And so this is the end of the painting. There's a lantern, a variety of lantern barriers, and then here we have these bystanders. I think are fairly interested in what's going on. It could be that this guy is pointing the way to the groom's house. These guys don't look the slightest bit interested in the wedding procession.
What are those roofs of the one?
What are these roofs? You know, I don't really know. And they don't actually make a lot of logical sense. I mean, it could be that this is the groom's house and they're going to come around like that. One of the things that I think is interesting about the painting is that it's about the transit of the bride from her house to the groom's house, and neither house is actually shown.
I have a question about maybe another idea about you said about the dragon. Could it also be like a symbol of her ancestors or her family, like maybe a mini shrine?
Yeah. It could be. I think that I think it's probably. It's probably more likely symbolic of the young, but that doesn't mean it's not something that was owned by her family, because it's stuff that is being transported from her house to his house. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I think in Qing and Ming Dynasty, the dragon represents the royal family, and if you are not any family member of the royal family, you couldn't be allowed to carry a symbol as dragon.
Well, there certainly are limitations on what you can do. I've read there are laws in Ming and Qing China that are called sumptuary laws, and the word sumptuary is related to the word consumption. Sumptuary law tells you if you're a merchant, you can't wear silk. They don't worry too much about peasants wearing silk. Peasants aren't going to wear silk, but they worry about merchants. And actually, there are exceptions that a groom can wear a dragon. It's kind of like he's emperor for a day. But I think that there is a kind of anxiety about dragons, so that dragon really perplexes me. There are also stories about dragons. When a carp swims upstream, it turns into a dragon, and that's why we got to worry about Asian carp, because the land will be full of dragons if we're not careful. And that's seen as an analogy to passing the civil service exams. When you pass the civil service exam, you become a dragon. Yes.
Traditionally, in a procession like this, would the bride's dowry also accompany the bride?
The bride's dowry might accompany the bride, or it might go earlier than she does. So there is some stuff that accompanies her, but it's not necessarily the whole thing.
In this painting, it doesn't appear like that you can identify, oh, here are the silks or the
No, I mean, there are some, yeah, yeah, back.
Further.
Well, okay, forward. Okay, there's some things here.
Yeah.
This looks like a red garment with a belt probably for a man. This might be paintings. I have no idea what these are. I mean, they might be, I have no idea what they are. They might be candles or something. But in the Dual painting, there are people carrying bedding. I mean, that is a dowry procession. And I think this is not a dowry procession. It's a wedding procession. Yes.
Well, I have a guess about the person with the umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
Could that be the beginning of the groom part of the procession? Now, with him as the beginning, and then with the garment, the belt, that's really shows the status of the groom. And the dragon is the symbol of male. So the groom should be one of the guys on the horse, a white horse with a red banner across his body, but it might be cut off.
Yeah, the really complicated thing about this is it could be that the guy on the white horse is the groom. That's actually a really interesting way of thinking about it. I'm pretty sure that in the Dual painting, the man on the horse is the groom, even though Dual says it isn't. I mean, but Dual didn't really know what he was seeing, and that painting certainly isn't a representation of the way things were. Because there is a little bit of repetition. I mean, you're right to see that, because here we have the kind of the balloony lanterns that kind of look like they are a kind of beginning. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Well, I feel like actually no woman was walking on the street. Were women not allowed to walk on the public?
Well, there are women walking immediately around the bride,
Yes.
but that's all. Upper class women were really only supposed to go out for religious festivals and things like that. There's one of the markers of upper class status was that women were able to stay home. I think that that's very much a class-based thing. I mean, you think about, I mean, even if you just think about the economics of it, if you're a peasant family, you can't keep your woman at home. She's got to work. But it's a class ideal. Female seclusion was a class ideal. And I think you do see that in this painting. And the women kind of peering out of the windows really reinforces that. And I think in some ways it's a little bit surprising for me to see the cluster of women around the bride. And, like I said, I mean, again, I may be over-interpreting and over-reading, but they just look to me to be so happy to be out and to be talking to one another and being dressed up. I mean, it just looks like a really festive occasion. You're gonna, yeah, well, yeah, I think if you keep going back, you'll find out.
That detail, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this, I mean, here, she could be shorter because she's younger. It is always possible that she's shorter because she's of lower status. But this woman kind of has her hand on her shoulder. I mean, there's a really nice interaction between those two women, a really nice interaction between those two women. I mean, she's got her hand lifted up. So, I mean, I think these are just charming. And these two women have some kind of role that's, I mean, I'm not quite sure what they're carrying there, but they have some kind of important ritual role, and so they're a little bit more serious. But this, I mean, I truly like that. And then like I was saying, these women peering through the window. I think they both suggest the importance of seclusion and how hard it is to seclude people. If you have windows, people are going to look out of them. So, are there any other questions? Okay. Oh my, we've
Just back.
why don't you can go? So it's almost 7 o'clock, and I didn't intend to talk for this long. I want to. Well, I guess I want to talk for just one paragraph because I've been working with soundscapes. The question, yeah, that's a good one. What did the bride hear? What can we tell about what the bride heard, or what the bystanders heard? Well, human voices, conversations of the women who surrounded her, friends and relatives. And the painter, I think, has gone to some trouble to show people talking. She would have heard firecrackers. She would have heard music from the groups of musicians. And the ducks and the horses might not have been silent. You can't see them now, but here, and I think in one other case, the peddlers have gongs or bellows. They're making noises. So it would have been a noisy scene. And I think it's a testament to the vitality of the painting that we can imagine the sounds from what we see in the scene. Okay, so I found this really cool document. I can talk to you about what's in it, but how do I make sense of it? What do we know about it? So what we know, the painting probably made for the Western export market, but certainly exported, found its way to Chantilly in France sometime before 1735, along with thousands of other objects from the East India Company trade. It was probably designed as wallpaper, and a segment was cut out of it, a practice which was not terribly unusual. So what do we make of the fact that it may have been designed for export? Is the visual information in the painting somehow skewed because it was designed for foreigners rather than a Chinese audience? I can't answer that question, but I think it's a question that needs to be kept in mind. And I think one of the things that we always need to keep in mind is all sources are skewed by the conditions of their production. Paintings are not photographs, and we know that photographs are not transparent representations of the world. So I think there's several ways of looking at the question. First of all, we see what the artist intended us to see. The problem with saying that is, how do we know what his intention was? And the problem is also us, because I guarantee you, the guy who painted this had never heard of us. That we are an audience very different from the foreign audience he was thinking of, if he was thinking of a foreign audience. A second way of looking at it is to say we see what the artist painted, but we don't quite see what the artist painted because we don't have 18th century Chinese minds, we don't have 18th century Chinese eyes. Some of the things that perplex us would have been completely obvious to an 18th century Chinese audience. We see what we have the capacity to see is another way of looking at it. And I think saying we see what we have the capacity to see is not quite the same thing as saying we see what we want to see. Seeing what we want to see is always a very, very big danger. I have been known to do that in public more than once. What we do, and what I mean by we see what we have the capacity to see, we ask educated questions, we put the document in context, which in this case is a context composed of texts, what we know about weddings, and other visual images. And at the end, I think I am still left with a lot of questions about this document. I hate to disappoint you, but this is a detective story without a final resolution. And at this point, I'm really happy to take questions, comments. Yes?
So you said you didn't really see, there's not many wedding parades. Is that having to do with like that it is an export, so they might have done a wedding parade because they're exporting it out to kind of show like the more festive side of China?
It could be. It could be.
I want to just hop back to that earlier, that may have an idea of what you're going to see. Oh, yes, they all are. Oh, no, they're all different now. Because my question was, in most paintings, school paintings in particular, you would read from right to left. And this one we're reading from left
You
to
know,
right. And I'm a bit perplexed by that, if it's not for an export audience.
yeah, I mean, I've gone around and around and around about that. And actually, the last time I gave this talk, I used that as a piece of evidence that it was done for export. But then somebody pointed out that, in fact, if our standpoint is here and we are watching where the bride is going to arrive, then we would not read it the way I read it. I mean, I read it as if the bride was at the center, but you could also read the painting this way. But I mean, I had to be persuaded of that.
Well, that's why I wanted to go look at the other examples quick, because if they were all the other way, then I think that would be a case for this being
Design.
evidence of being for export, but because they all are this way, I think the other interpretation is stronger because it's from the standpoint of the group, or the group's standpoint.
Yes.
And to add on that, because also the fact that could be maybe her house, and also the gates are on the other side. So it could be that she's could be leaving the village
Right.
instead of entering.
Right. Well, I think she's leaving, and then we don't actually know where she's going to end up.
Because it looks like the gate was on the other side.
Right. There's a gate. Yeah. There's a gate here that she's probably come through.
I think if you read it the other direction, then as an audience, you're anticipating her arrival, not her departure.
Yeah. And actually, I suppose in some ways the arrival is a bigger deal than the departure, but that's a great point. Thank you. Other questions, comments?
Could the darker skinned people just be dirty? Like when I first looked at them, I thought they just looked dirty and like they were sick and maybe going to get medicine from the person.
Well-
that isn't essentially like a darker skin complexion.
They could be dirty. I don't actually think it's racialized. I think it's class. I think peasants were seen as having darker skin, and I don't know. I mean, sometimes when I say that and show things to people, they say, oh, it's just discoloration. I'm not so sure about that, but it's hard. I think it's a class thing. And in the case of the people who are getting medicine, those darker people do kind of look miserable, especially the little guy. Other questions, comments? Yes.
I liked how, like, you know, the houses right there, they don't really have that, like, curved edge. Well, on the other photo,
Oh,
they had, like, the curved edge.
oh, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
If you look at the
Yeah, I mean, so these houses have curved edges and are looping up, and these buildings are square. This is an example of an addition where the guy didn't know what he was doing. I'm pretty sure this is a half moon, and somebody just kind of went wild. That's quite humorous.
Yeah,
Um,
that looks like
It looks like some foreigner did that. Whereas, you know, that's really pretty well done. But that gate is just silly.
didn't know what
Right, he had no idea, but he kind of felt,
back around like this.
but he really felt like something had to go on top. Other questions or comments? Well, I've been told you have general questions for me.
So you all prepared questions?
That's my source, yes.
I totally forgot my question. So like when you came upon this like image, did you look at any other sources to depict like what their clothing is or
Yeah.
why they're wearing this? That sort of
Well, I did, and I guess I saw this, I actually saw this for the first time in October. So I haven't had much of a chance to work on it, but I looked at images of the Qing emperors went on southern tours, and they were painted very extensively. And there's actually one great website, I think it's a Columbia University website, of the Kangxi Emperor in Suzhou, and it is so detailed that you can read the shop signs. And whoever did the website has actually transcribed and translated the shop signs. So, but that's very, very, very densely populated. The human figures are tiny, and there's not a lot of attention paid. I mean, these people are just so lovingly portrayed. I looked at a genre called the Gungzhi Tu. I showed you one image of it that it ends up, it's an earlier genre than the Qing Dynasty, but it gets really revived in the Qing Dynasty. I looked at woodblock prints. I mean, I've been looking for images that that resonate with this, and I've not really found them. I think that I'm not saying that I think this is the only wedding procession painted. I think this is not high art, and I think that that it's an example of the kind of thing that maybe didn't get preserved. I mean, I think actually it's a really wonderful painting. I'm very, very fond of it. But one of the things that art historians like Craig Clunas and James Cahill have made clear, like in the last 10 or 15 years, is we think the visual world of the Ming and Qing dynasties was stuff that ended up in museums. Most people weren't surrounded by museum quality stuff. And so I think that there is a really strong possibility that there is a visual world that we don't have any longer because it wasn't treasured and preserved. And this is preserved because it ended up in a book in the French National Library. But I think your question about what else have I looked at to make visual sense of it, I mean, that is a great question. That is the question. And it's why I'm going to pick her brain, because she's looked at Carol, because she's looked at way more pictures than I
Yeah, I was
have.
going to say, you don't want to look at some of the Tang Dynasty stuff, I have never seen that servant breaking the fourth wall be a male. It's always a female.
But that's a male, right?
Yeah, that's a male.
Huh.
And it goes back to the Tang Dynasty, and it's this, everybody else is active, and then there'll be this one forward female, you can count it, that's one. And that's what he's doing. And I've never seen a male do that, ever. So I'm not sure what to make of it, but that's something you need to pursue.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. You had your hand up?
You said at the beginning that wedding processions aren't a very common thing that are portrayed. How come that is?
Well, I don't know. I could give you a bunch of answers, none of which I'm sure I believe. Their families are not portrayed in art very much. A long time ago, I decided that I was commissioned to write an article for a book on childhood and Chinese art, and I thought, well, I'm gonna find family portraits, and I'm gonna write on that. And I even knew where I was gonna look. I was gonna look at biographies of virtuous women, and there just weren't any. I mean, there are lots of mothers and children, and occasionally there were either fathers and children, but I never saw a mama, papa, kid, ever. And one of the things that's really interesting, and Carol has heard me say this, for the first time Carol heard me say this is probably 15, 20 years ago. One of the things that interests me so much about photography in China is when photography comes into China, bam, you get people who are really into having family portraits made. And so it's not a genre for which there is a deep history. So one of the things that people used to say, there aren't family portraits in China because there's not representational art in China. That is patently untrue. There's a lot of representational art in China. One of the things that you say, and when I say you here, I mean people in the Ming and Qing dynasty. One of the things people in the Ming and Qing dynasty said is, you don't talk about respectable women in public. That the family is kind of private and restricted. Well, I mean, maybe you don't talk about respectable women in public, but people sure did. I mean, there's a lot of writing begins by saying, well, I know you don't talk about respectable women in public, but if I don't talk about her in public, how I'm going to celebrate her. So I think that there probably is a different. I mean, I think that making images is different than writing texts. But I also think, so I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are the closest thing to a family portrait that I can think of, and one of these days I'll end up writing on it, is the Gu Jianlong painting of Wang Shimin that's in the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. It's great, but if you looked at it. If you weren't looking for family portraits, you would never think it's a family portrait. It's an architectural drawing of a house. And in the center, there's a guy who's kind of lounging like this, and he hasn't even bothered to close his robe. I mean, he's a famous painter, and he's just too cool to care. And he's surrounded by servants, and then the rest of the family is kind of off to the side in different places. And so it is a family portrait. It is the family in the house, but it's very different. It's very different than this. I mean, I think that the painter of that painting was. I mean, I don't think he was as interested in the house as he was in Wang Shimin. I mean, I think the guy who's the center of the painting is what really interests him, but it's important to him to place that in a really architecturally complex place. And this, I mean, the architecture, I mean, these are charming little buildings, but they're not architecturally complicated. So, I mean, that question, why do we not see wedding processions? Why do we not see more things like that prior to the 20th century is a really great question. You do, I think you do see more and more of those things in woodblock prints and in popular genres. But those are things that haven't been preserved from earlier times. We know there are lots of popular woodblock prints in the 16th century, and they don't survive well. Yes?
So I'm a little bit curious because at this time they would have like rituals, especially like if they had to make a sacrifice to the ancestors. So would some of the objects in the picture also maybe be showing different things that was sent for sacrifices?
Well, they could be. Yeah, yes.
But the sacrifice part is generally done after the bride arrives
Arrived, right.
into the household. Then there
Right.
will be ceremonies for that.
Right.
This is on the street.
Right. But I think your question was maybe some of the, like maybe the dragon is being taken and will be used. I don't know. Yeah.
I'm just kind of interested in how you got interested in Asia. Like what first, like, when you were younger brought you to doing all of this?
Well, I actually do not have a good question to that, a good answer to that. When I was in college, I took a course in Chinese history. I liked it. I took another one. I was pretty sure I wanted to do history, and I didn't actually make the final decision to do China rather than Europe until it was time to apply to graduate school. I mean, I just thought it was really interesting and really fun. Yes.
What interested you in doing weddings and Chinese history instead of like doing other things?
Why am I interested in weddings? Well, that's also a great question. I'm interested in women and women's history. I'm also interested in life cycle and life cycle transitions. I'm interested in ritual and the way people mark important transitions. And so it just seemed that weddings were an interesting thing to focus on. In deep contrast to the fact that there are not a lot of visual representations, people write about weddings all the time. They're just, they write about weddings, they write tirades against how people spend too much money on weddings. There's actually a very funny 18th century debate by these uptight Confucian men about exactly when does a marriage become a marriage. And the key issue, of course, is it a marriage before it's been consummated or not? And so you get all of these men writing sort of in proper circles around the whole questions about sex. So there's, and the, it's very clear to everybody where the next generation of human beings comes from. I mean, that, that weddings are how families perpetuate themselves. And so there's really a lot written on them. It's very textually rich. Yes.
If you study 红楼梦,
Mm-hmm.
you have a lot of wedding.
Right.
You have a lot of writing and poetry. Or if you study 八经, his whole writing in Chengdu, and then you said Dupu, so there are plentiful of this kind of
Right.
But usually, it's not considered high art.
Right.
And so most of the time you can get just in any store, block painting, 小说. It's not like something that you hold especially and only show special intellectuals hold.
Yeah,
And
both of the. Go ahead.
architecturally, for instance, like this, you can tell by the roof cone, and this is temple. And the 11 animals is considered the highest one. So only temples and palaces has that. So you have to go to Beijing to Palace Museum to see that. And you can see that the dragon head, and tails and all of that. Roof cone,
Here you
roof
mean?
cone. And depends on what style. you know,
Yeah.
town style doesn't get that far.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think this
change
is very strange. I mean, I think it's sort of you know, I don't understand the logic of the building. But the two texts she was mentioning, Home Among, which exists in a really fine English translation by David Hawkes and John Minford called The Story of the Stone. It's a novel about, well, it's a novel about the creation of the universe, but it's also a novel about a group of young cousins who live by themselves, not exactly by themselves, but almost by themselves in a garden. And it's a novel about adolescent coming of age. And then the second author she mentions is Bai Jin, who wrote a novel in the early 20th century called Family. And both of those are really great sources. I think that The Story of the Stone is just absolutely one of the best sources for the nitty-gritty of everyday family life in upper classes. It may be, the degree of luxury may be exaggerated, but it's just a great source. And there are weddings and funerals and birthday celebrations and things like that.
But they're reading the introduction and the first chapter of the Story of the Stone.
Oh, okay, great.
You should be reading chapter 17 and 18 on the garden.
Yeah,
That's my bias. Yeah, because I think there's
Are there other questions or comments? Well, if not, thank you very much.